So we were discussing the problem of Eidei Kiyum, the difference between the role of the function of Eidus in Ishus, as opposed to other categories, other categories in Halakha. And what we were trying to develop is, again, we're trying to pursue the question whether or not the type of evidence, of witnesses that are required in the function of the witnesses in the context of a marriage and divorce, whether that is the same as the role and function of witnesses, in more typical settings where there's need for verification, where there's some sort of dispute, and the only way to solve it is, by means of providing evidence. So again, the background for this, as we've been discussing, is the Gemara on Samachei Omid Beis in Kiddushin, right? So there, the Gemara, tells us that if a person's mekadesh in the presence of one witness or no witnesses, even though the husband and wife both agree that the marriage would be binding and that they actually underwent the ceremony, that nonetheless, this is, an invalid marriage, or basically a waste of time, unless there actually is a presence of witnesses. The Gemara says, since it's chav lachrini, since it affects other people adversely, the principle of hodas valdin kamedim dami doesn't apply. The idea that admission of the impacted parties, that should determine, that is not going to be sufficient, and therefore you need Eidim. So what we have been discussing for the last two shiurim is a very, very important topic, and that is, what is the difference between what we call Eidei Kiyum, Eidim that define or affirm or validate a marriage, and the more typical concept of Eidei Birur, which is verification. And there are basically broadly speaking, two positions that we have been witnessing. One is that even Ishus really only requires Eidei Birur. The only thing is that we can't rely on the parties and on their veracity. We have to have some sort of a guarantee of, evidence in case there is a dispute, because the stakes involved are far, far too significant simply to rely on people's words. But basically, Eidei Birur and Eidei Kiyum are not that different from each other. Or no, shall we say that Eidei Kiyum really creates the marriage, it's part of the definition of the marriage, and as such, absent Eidei Kiyum, it's not just, since we can't verify, therefore we won't validate. It's more that, an important ingredient of the marriage itself is simply missing, and therefore this just doesn't constitute a marriage. So what we saw so far is 3 or 4 issues connected. Number one, how do you define chav lachrini? What does chav lachrini mean? We say that as long as other parties are involved, therefore you need Eidei Kiyum. So the way that this is a machlokas between, good to see the Chazan, between Rashi and the Rajba. Rashi says that chav lachrini means that there are relatives. And since other people are affected by the marriage, therefore we don't believe the husband and the wife, because there are other parties that are not represented in their hodas baldin. And therefore, we insist on evidence. That's how Rashi interprets.
Is it fair to say that this is only an asurin?
Well, either way, Eidei Kiyum is only going to apply to Ishus.
So in other words, it could be $1 billion involved, and it affects many other people. But since it's not a question of isurin, but rather momonos.
Right, but it isn't straight isurin either. It's Ishus. But right, anything that's momon, if there is hodas baldin kamedim dami, if it's chav lachrini, you might need evidence in a court case, but you don't need evidence to validate a transaction, per se. In other words, if you and I go into a small room, quiet room, and we make a $1 billion deal, and we do a proper kinyan, and there's no evidence, as long as we both agree that it took place, the transaction.
Yeah.
However, if Mr. X and Miss Y, went into a room, and they know that he, gave her a tabas and that she accepted, and that he said, Israel. And then they came out of the room and they, told everybody their good news. It wouldn't be valid. That's a difference. That's a very big
And the
difference.
question is whether it's definitional, it's just the
Correct.
nature of the act, or it's because it has such extreme
That's exactly the question. So what I'm trying to say is that the Rajba seems to say that it's about the consequences, but there isn't a fundamental difference. And the Ritva, who says that it affects, all sorts of interesting things. Let's say you have witnesses who are there, but they're not, known to the, to the chassan and the kal. Or let's say there are, ptulim and krovim in the crowd, and are we worried about what's the critical moment of the witnesses at a wedding? Is it the moment of the ceremony, or is it, only down the road in case they have to testify in court if there is some sort of, dispute? So again, the Ritva in the name of the Ra'ah is the one who, among the Rishonim, takes the most powerful position, declaring that Edei Kiyum is about validation, it's about definition, etc. And the Rajba, is the one who takes the position that there isn't such a big difference between Edei Kiyum and Edei Bir. And that's kind of where we were and what we were discussing. So I want to
read the Talmud of both of them.
The Ritz was a student of both the Ra'ah and the Rajba.
So he took sides on this one?
Yes. So first of all, he did take sides explicitly. He says, I'll just read the quote, but you're so right. He totally took sides. Here, this is on in the Marmakomas that we have. This is on page, I think it's page 2. It says Kiddusha Ritva Masachet Kiddusha Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. Look at the at the end of the first paragraph. Kach Hora Rabbeinu Neru, referring to the Ra'ah, Halacha Lamaisa. He said, "My Rebbe, the Ra'ah. This is how he actually ruled, in practical cases." And then he says, even though this is not the consensus view of the Mefarshim, and undoubtedly he meant other Rebbe, the Rajba as well. V'roi lahachmir. So, but the right thing to do is to follow. By the way, I think I've said this in the past, but if I haven't, it's worth repeating. The Ritva is such an interesting character because of what you just said. I mean, he's a student of the Rajba and the Ra'ah. The Rajba and the Ra'ah, it's doubly interesting. The Rajba and the Ra'ah are probably the two most prominent students of the Ramban.
What was the Ramban's position on this?
We don't know. At least I don't know. He doesn't weigh in as far as I know. So the two most prominent, students were the Ra'ah and the Rajba. And they both lived in Barcelona, by the way. And, the most well-known student of the Ra'ah and of the Rajba is the Ritva. So they have like a common Rebbe and a common Talmud. But what's not so well known is that the Ritva on the whole is more of a loyalist to the Ra'ah than he is to the Rajba, of the Rajba. The world thinks the opposite. The reason is because we don't have...
I don't understand. You can have different opinions? You have to go by your Rebbe every time?
No. I'm just saying...
It's like Democrats, Republicans? I'm saying, what's wrong with being on different...
No, there's nothing wrong. I'm just telling you the reality. The reality is that, people are very influenced by their teachers. Let's say you could disagree as much as you want, but mostly, if you're trained a certain way and somebody's your Rebbe, part of what makes him the Rebbe Muvak is the fact that you follow him. You have choice. You think he's right. More.
Is that more with halacha? Halacha, but lundish.
fine.
You could think different ways, right, Andy? Saying
No,
lundish, you could think.
Even in the halacha, you can be independent of your Rebbe. But the likelihood is in both that we're talking about very great
But the
how much
reality also is that if there's a derech that you follow, whether it be in today's day, the
when I
brisket,
say the
whatever,
Ritva
you're
is
going to reach certain conclusions by
Yeah.
following certain derech.
right. I mean, it's natural. We know that in our own cases, everybody has mentors, right? So I have mentors. I don't agree with them on all things, but I look to my mentors as authority figures and as people who default. I chose them as my mentors. I respect
But
them.
you can have multiple
One
mentors.
tends to use their methodology, which usually leads to certain conclusions.
Telephone, no Wi-Fi. It'll only be up 3 p.m. tomorrow.
Oh,
I
wow.
hope you don't have to use your computer for anything.
Okay. Sorry, I'm having internet problems. I'm on cellular
What I'm
problems.
saying is that if you follow the methodology of, say, your Rebbe, then usually that ends up with conclusions that are similar, because the methodology that defines the conclusions in many
It's
cases.
not, as I say, it's not this is not, forced upon you. This is all voluntary, but you follow somebody because of your respect for them. And so as it happens, actually, I think I mentioned this last week, the Rajba and the Ra'ah, the students of the Ramban, the Rebbe of the Ritva, they also were probably the two most influential, forces on matters of Yoredeya, because the Rajba wrote a book called Torah Habayis, in which all the Isser V'Heter topics, Shkita and Basar B'Chalav and Haroves and Nida and Dam and Malicha and all the what we call Yoredeya. The Rajba kind of wrote his own, not completely, but his own Yoredeya. He was very influential in the actual Yoredeya, the Shulchan Aruch, the Torah and Shulchan Aruch. The Rajba is very, very high, prominently featured. So he wrote a book called Torah Habayis, and his colleague and rival, the Ra'ah, he wrote a critique of it. It's published together. It's called Bedek Habayis. And then the Rajba himself wrote a response to the critique called Mishmeres Habayis. And they're very, very lively exchanges.
But the Rashba was sort of the acknowledged leader of the community, no?
Well, the Rajba wrote the most tshuvas maybe of any Rishon, except maybe for the Maram Rutenberg. He wrote thousands of tshuvas, and he was considered to be, like the most prominent posek of that period in Spain. But I don't know that he had more stature than the Ra'ah. Sometimes the Ra'ah is actually a more creative thinker, but they're both very, very prominent. But what I was saying about the Ritva, this is again aside, this is not really our topic, but we sometimes, talk about these broader things, is that the Rajba, we have voluminous material from the Rajba. We have Chidushim on many, many Masechtas, and we have his Chuvas, and we have his Torah Habayis, and he wrote something else on Eris and Eruvin and Shabbos and Tchumin, Avodas HaMelech. He wrote a lot, and what he wrote, the mazel was that it's all, it all survived, and it was all, published many times, etc. The Ra'ah clearly wrote much more than what we have. So we have the Bedek Habayis, we have his comments on brachos and on ksuvos, and a few other mesechtas, but we don't have it on all Shas. Often, many of the things that we know from the Ra'ah, we know from the Ritva, his student. So because of that, because we're so much more familiar with the writings of the Rajba than of the Ra'ah, it's, it becomes hard for people to evaluate the influence. And because the Rajba is just, so much more accessible than the Ra'ah, people just assume that the Ritva was first and foremost, his student. But if you look in any Masechta where we have the Ra'ah and the Rajba, and then you read the Ritva, it takes a lot of work to do these things, you'll see that he is much more faithful to the Ra'ah and his thinking than he is the Rajba. And when he says Rabbeinu Neru is a Rashi Tevos, because he was still alive. He always refers to the Ra'ah. I mean, his stam is the
faithful. When Rabbi says faithful, you mean faithful in the way they think? And faithful is like a weird, like a strong word.
Faithful meaning he identified as a matter
Right.
of
I wouldn't call that faithful, but he
Well,
leans in learning that way. Faithful is like, faithful
in
means
your mind.
if he thinks differently or learns differently, he's unfaithful. That's a strong word.
No. I'm just saying he identifies more strongly, and he definitely perceives himself. This is not so well known. I'm just telling you from my studies, it's very, very clear.
But
We know a lot of Ra'ah through the Ritva, and we
but
don't know how many, Stam Ritvas that are different than Rajbas, are also really Ra'ahs. He was a very consistent and very devoted student who followed his Rebbe's path. Sometimes he disagreed. Sometimes he went with the Rajba. Sometimes he just had his own independent ideas. But in the bigger picture, he is first and foremost a student of the Ra'ah, and then secondarily a student of the Rajba, in my opinion. But again, it's not so well known. Anyway, this is a great example of it. So he says, that the idea of, for example, of being miyachid edim at a wedding, that, designating witnesses, that comes from the Ra'ah, and the Ritva endorses it. And then the next part, the Cheinam Ar Mori Naru, the Ra'ah also said that if you have edim who are tmunim achori ageder, that they're hiding behind the wall, and the kasan and the kala, or one or the other, doesn't know that they're there, that's also not going to work for the same reason, because Eidei Kiyum isn't about authenticating or verifying what took place. It's about validating, and being given extra stature, being present to kind of, elevate.
To define the act.
To define the act, and therefore knowledge of their presence, is crucial. So these are some of the shitas. Then I think I mentioned last time that there'll be other issues too. So, for example, there's a very interesting issue, what we call edus miuchedes. So a little bit of background with that, and then I'll if you look on page 3, probably in the Marmakomos, you'll have a little bit of it. So the Rif in Gittin on Lamed Hayamid Beis in the Dapei Rif quotes a Tosefta. It was on page 3. The Tosefta says, 1 second. Ra'uhu shnayim shenisyachta imo tzricha himenu get sheni. So if two people are about to get a divorce, or they get a divorce, and then you witness them, secreting away, yichud, which they shouldn't do unless they're married. So this is the Tosefta, this based on the Mishnah. So you have to worry that they kind of rekindle their marriage, with Kiddushay Bia, and therefore you need to get sheni.
But what was that? Were they divorced or getting divorced?
They were divorced.
They were divorced.
Oh, they were divorced. Okay, I'm sorry.
They were divorced, and then they behaved in a way that implied that they had gotten married again. And there was the yichud was witnessed by 2 edims, so that could be the Eidei Kiyum, assuming something can happen. Heinen Eidei Yichud, we say.
Is that yichud acting as chuppah or what?
Yeah, so it's not as chuppah, no, but as a likely Kiddushay Bia. So but if it's listen to this. So Tosefta says, but echad, let's say only one witness saw this, Eina tzricha heimenu get sheni. Then of course it would be in the worst case scenario, if they were remarried through Kiddushay Bia, there would only be one witness. Therefore, nothing to worry about.
That would sound like the Raw's approach, no?
No. Everybody's approach, because Makadish.
No, because if you're worried about the importance of the act,
right? But either way, the Rajba, everybody agrees you need Eidei Kiyum. The question is, do you need Eidei Kiyum, and it's not valid if you don't have it because there's not enough proof, or because there's not enough presence. But everybody agrees you need 2 witnesses. That's the Gemara. The Gemara says Makadish b'fnei Dechayin Choshen Kedushin. This is an example of it. This is the introduction. But then the next line, the Gemara says, but what if you have Echad b'Shacharis, the echad bein harbayim. This is interesting. Let's say there was 2 acts of yichud. One was in the morning, and that was witnessed by one witness, and one was in the afternoon, and that was seen by a second witness. In other words, Ruvain and
Why should that make a difference?
oh, 1 second. So the Tosefta says, first of all, before we get, so there shouldn't be any problem. So there shouldn't be any misconception. Zehoya Maisa. The Tosefta says this is something that happened. Meaning, what happened here? Reuven and Sarah were married. Reuven and Sarah got divorced. Then Reuven and Sarah are seen together.
10 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock at night.
10 o'clock in the morning by one aid, and again 6 o'clock in the evening by another aid. So the Tosefta says that if this is what happens, right, Zelia Maisa, the Amru Ein Mitzarfin, they can't combine, and therefore it's not a problem. Okay,
That's the logical approach because
Okay.
No, that's very creative. It's two. You never see 2 different acts at 2 different times combined. Where do you see such a concept? It's
Okay.
very creative.
Where do
Say
you
you
see?
see a guy kill someone, in the morning, and then he kills someone at night. Can't kill. You can never do
Okay,
that.
so you're half right. You're half right. You're half right in that you're on the right track. Like, do we see this anywhere? Why would we even think that this would be effective? Correct. But you're half wrong.
there is something we learned where it is correct. I just forgot what it was. But 2 acts.
Maybe
So it's
thinking of
called-
the 8 echad by Yavamas, maybe.
No. It's called Edus Miyuchedes. So Edus Miyuchedes, there are 2 types of Edus Miyuchedes. The word Edus Miyuchedes means in individual Eduyos, meaning combining one and one. But there are 2 cases of it. One is Ra Echad Michalon Zeh, it's Mishnah and Makos, Echad Michalon Zeh, meaning 2 witnesses saw something, one and one. They didn't see each other. Each saw it from a different vantage point, but they saw the same one case.
But they saw the same
Now,
act, right?
That's not. That would be the same act. But there's another. 1 second. But there's another Edus Miyuchedes that's called either Halva'a Achar Halva'a or Hoda'a Achar Hoda'a. And in Dine Mamonis it works, and in Dine Nefashos it doesn't work. In other words, let's say this is a very interesting case. Let's say one witness saw Ruvain lend money to Shimon at 10 in the morning, right? And then another witness saw Ruvain lend money to Shimon, at 6 o'clock in the evening.
That's the case, I remember, yeah.
Each one is a witness. Each transaction, these are 2 separate loans. They took place at different times, right?
They combined.
But each one was seen only by one witness. Now, like Jacob said before, where do you see such a thing? And he gave the example, correct? Like, what, one guy sees a murder in the, let's say you saw that, Bob, killed Bill, Khalila, in the morning. They can't kill him again in the afternoon. But let's say killed somebody else. So Bob killed Bill in the morning at 10 a.m. And Bob killed Brian, at 6 p.m. And one witness sees Brian's murder of the morning. Another witness sees Brian's murder of the afternoon. So this is the halakha. This is the famous view of Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, it's called. When it comes to Dinei Mamonis, you're chayiv. You can combine them. And when it comes to nefashos, you can't. Meaning,
But the cases are not similar.
what's not
It would be similar if somebody saw Bob beat up Bill at 10 o'clock in the morning, and another witness saw Bob beat Bill up again at 6 o'clock at night, that would be similar to the 2 halvas.
Right. So let's say it wasn't about the money, but it was about the malchus. Well, you could use that case too. But basically, we're trying to figure out whether or not we can convict, Bob as a murderer. And in the Dinei Mamonis case, we're trying to find out if we can. If you're right, it's a little bit different. We're trying to figure out whether whether Bill owes Bob $100. Right. So does it make sense to distinguish between money and nefashos? It does. It's not obvious, so obvious that this should work ever, but it does in some level. In some level, what we're saying is there are two witnesses.
Even though it said Al Pishnayim Edom Yokim Dover for everything.
Well, there are Shnayim. There are two witnesses that say that Bob owes Bill. I'm sorry, that Bill owes Bob $100.
But not on the same way. See, the two people from the window on the opposite sides. you can
Right.
see that. They saw
Oh,
the
that's-
same act.
I'm just trying to give you the full picture. So there are when we use the phrase in the halacha edus miyuchades, which means individual edim, we sometimes mean echad ra michalon zeh ve'echad ra michalon zeh. Two people see the same thing, but they don't see it from the same vantage point or together. They see it separately, but they're seeing one action. That's obviously, and that doesn't work in Dinei Nefashos either, by the way. But that's obviously a lot more understandable. Why you could combine those two things. But the other one is called Hoda Achar Hoda, V'Halva Achar Halva. That's Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. And there the chiddush is that in Dinei Mamonos, even though they're seeing two different transactions, two different loans, since there are now two witnesses who can attest to the common denominator, namely that Bill owes Bob $100, you'll collect. But in Dinei Nefashos,
And which one does he collect? On both?
no, it's the same person.
No, but
Same loan?
Bob lent money.
According to the witnesses,
Well, let's hear the
Bill
case.
Bill
Let's hear
borrowed
the
two
case.
times $100.
Right, so he's not going to collect $200. He's going to collect $100.
So what we're saying?
If Bill
one-
was a
one
Talmud
works.
Chacham and he learned this Inyan, he'd be smart to deny one of the and admit the other one. In which case,
Well, it
he
doesn't
would
make a
only
difference
one
because
witness.
he could deny
All
it
right.
as the idea of Edus Mucheres and Dinei Mamonos, he could deny as much as he wants. But aren't there two witnesses that say he owes at least $100?
No, but on one of them, he's going to admit. So that case goes away. Now he's left with the other case.
But
There's
that
only
he's
one-
not smart, but he's not smart because either way, he's not going to pay more than $100,
You got a point. Okay, yeah,
right?
right.
So that's called Edus Mucheres and Dinei Mamonos. So when you said before, you said like, "Oh, that's an interesting case," but where would you have such a thing? The answer is normally we do have such a thing, and we distinguish between Dinei Mamonos and Dinei Nefashos. Now we're asked the Tosefta. Listen to this. The Tosefta is pondering this case in Ishus, meaning in marriage, because what happens?
Right. They're a little bit different, even though it's a great, because
Reuben
again, like
married Sarah in the morning with one witness. Then he married her again in the afternoon with one witness. And the question is, you combine them. So the Tosefta says, no, we don't. But the question now is, so that there's no controversy that we don't. Now the question is, why don't we? So the answer that we all instinctively think, the answer is because if you need two witnesses as a dekiyum, meaning that without the presence of two witnesses, that you haven't validated the action itself needs two witnesses.
No, that's not the reason. The reason is because the second witness and the first witness are contradicting each other. Because if he was married in the morning, then the
They're
second
not- they're
act
not
couldn't have been a marriage.
Right, but they're not contradicting each other. Each saw a ceremony. I mean,
But they
you know-
contradict each other because if he was married in the morning, that second thing wasn't a marriage.
oh, yeah, that's clever. I hear that. Okay, I hear that. I'm not right, but between the two of them, they can both, since it wasn't yet validated by a second aid, maybe. I hear that. It's an interesting point. No one makes that point, but that's a good point. I like it. I have to think more about that. But let me say it this way. The more we think that Eidei Kiyum is about validating, it's part of the definition, creating something, this certainly is not going to work. Because 0 plus 0 is 0. So the morning was a 0. There's only one aid. The afternoon or the evening, whatever it was, is a 0, and that's nothing. However, let's say we say it's Eidei Kiyum is just a required guarantee of Eidei Biur. So then, in theory, the ceremony should work, just that we're not going to validate it unless we have evidence. But now we have evidence, even though the evidence comes from two different ceremonies, but between the two things that we're seeing, right, since each one in principle would work, aside from your consideration, which I think is a good one, But you can see what I'm saying is you can begin to discuss this intelligently if you hold like the Rajba on Eidei Birur. If you hold like the Ra'ah and the Ritva, there's nothing to discuss. So, but what's fascinating here is that the Rajba and the Ran, I'm going to show you this in a second, weigh in on explaining this halacha. And actually, of all people, the Rajba says, this is ridiculous. It's Mekadesh Bifnei Echad, and it's nothing. And maybe because of what you just said. Namely, that in a certain sense, you can't combine these because each one, is makes the other,
Impossible.
impossible. But what's more fascinating is that the Ran thought that in theory you could combine them, except that he has the following consideration. He says, you know what? He doesn't say it this way, but this is what it comes down to. In theory, you could combine these two edim of two different actions. The only reason we don't is because is Ishus a capital case, a Nefashos case, or a Mammon case?
Right now, it's not in the
No, in general, if you had to classify it. If I told you Edus Muchedes works in Mammonis and it doesn't work in Nefashos, should it work in Ishus? So the Ran will say, I'm going to read it inside just a second. The Ran says, well, there are Dinei Nefashos consequences.
Dinei Nefashos, because if somebody gets together with this woman after this event, if she was really married to him, it's
Okay, look,
capital crime.
So the Ran says that's the reason why this doesn't work. So that's shocking because what's he saying? If not for that reason, it would work. So now look at the Ran. Everybody have the Ran in front of them? Look at the Ran.
We learned the same question on the Ran a couple of years ago on a different Masechta. The same logic was, and I asked you the same question, that it's only an implied issue. We don't know for sure that's
it could be some other. It's possible. I just don't remember. But look at the Ran here. It's on Lamed Haywood based on the Dapei Rif. The Ran is commenting on this Tosefta. So he says the Afal Gav Dilagabe Mamon Kaimalon the Perik Zaborer the Halva Akar Halva, maybe in Sanhedrin, the Halva Akar Halva Behoda Akar Hoda Mitztarfin. Whoa, what does that mean? Even though in Dinei Mammon is, like we said before, if Bob lent Bill $100 in the morning, and then one person saw it, and then Bob lent Bill another $100 in the afternoon, and another person saw it, even though it's two transactions, each with only one aid, we'll say that the two can combine to say he owes him at least $100. He doesn't owe him $200, but he owes him $100 between the two. Mimanas Shach, he owes him $200. So the Ran is saying, right? Afal gav de legabe mamon kaimel perik zabora halva achar halva hoda achar dam mitzarfin legabe ishus shayach bedinei nefashos, right? Bivasachas boilahu. We compare ishus to dinei nefashos, not to dinei mamonis, and dinei nefashos. This doesn't work. So it sounds like a reasonable argument, but it's actually a shocking argument, because what's the Ran saying? If not for the dinei nefashos classification of ishus, edus muchedes, of halva, akar halva, would work in marriage? Meaning, in principle, if one aide saw the morning ceremony and one aide saw the afternoon ceremony, they could combine. The only reason not is because since there are, occasionally implications that cross into dinei nefashos, therefore the standard isn't good enough.
Well,
but if you look,
isn't he saying that the demarcation between Dinei Mamos and Dinei Surin is pushed aside? That he's basically saying if it was just plain a question of an Isser, it would
if
apply.
there's a problem of Eidei Kiyum, it would work. The problem is that if there's an element of nefashos, that's what he's saying. But that's not true. Why? How can it work as Eidei Kiyum? How can it work if Eidei Kiyum define the ishus 0 plus 0 is 0? The answer is the only way to explain the Ran. I think there are two ways to explain the Ran, actually. One is that what the Ran is saying is that Eidei Kiyum are just the guarantee of Birur. So you have Birur because you have a morning. You have two people who can tell you that there was a ceremony, even though it was two different ceremonies at two different times. But between both between each person's testimony. We know that Reuven gave Leah or Sarah a ring, and he said Harayat Mekudeshesli. We have two people can testify. They're each testifying about a different time. So what? In the end of the day, if the action stands on its own right and the witnesses are just there because the stakes are so high that we need more verification, so we have our verification. Except that one problem, since it's also nefashos, that's one explanation of the Raj. But if you look at the Rajba, on the same page, you have Chidusha Rajba, Masachet Gittin, Pei Aleph Umid Beis. The Rajba basically here goes the other way. The Rajba says, this is Eidei Kiyum. 0 plus 0 is 0. Look at it. Look what he says.
But the definition of Eidus still stands, that you still need two, even if you don't hold like the
Yeah,
you still need two witnesses to be considered Eidus.
Right, but do you need the combination of two Eidus or two Eidus at one?
That's not two witnesses, people seeing two different events. I mean, that's let's
Well,
get
it is a Dine
reality.
Mamonis.
Huh?
Dine Mamonis requires the Eidus too, on a verification level.
That's true.
And Eidus Yuchedes qualifies. Why? Because it's Eidus al Chiyuv Hagavra. There aren't two witnesses on the single transaction, but there are two witnesses that can tell you that A owes money to B. That's what's so interesting about the case.
Well, in Mominus, even one aid would require a shvua.
Right, but we're not talking about a shvur. We're talking about
No,
winning.
but so we see that one aid has some power in Mominus.
That's true. That's true. That's all true. But
I have, if I may, I have another issue that I don't seem to hear in this discussion. I'm sorry I missed two shiurim because I was in Israel, but here is my question. When these Eidim see whether it was a marriage or whether Moshe gave Yankel a halvoah of $100, they have to be close to the act. If they are too far, they may see it, but they don't know the nature of this giving of the money because they don't hear Moshe say to Yankel, I do it for you. Why doesn't this point come up in this entire discussion?
Why should it? I'm not sure. You're totally right that the Eidim have to not only be in the room, but they have to hear and they have to see. Why are you assuming that they don't?
Because they may be far away and they saw it from different.
They
had
can,
the issue that saw it. You quoted the Gemara in Makos that they were from two different spots and could be far.
No. That just means that it doesn't mean that each one doesn't see clearly what he's seeing.
They may be seeing it, but they don't hear the nature of what's going on.
Well, they hear it too. How do you know? They're all within the range of being able to identify exactly what happened. They don't see.
And if they're not,
if they're not, then it wouldn't be Eidos. If we need them to hear, in addition to see, for their testimony to be effective, then then that's the standard. And if we didn't meet the standard, then they would be dismissed. But there's nothing about any of these cases that implies that there is a lowering of standards, visual or audio. So you're totally right. It's just I'm not sure why. When we say echad michalon zeh, echad michalon zeh, it doesn't mean that they're so far away. It just means that he's seeing it on the right side and he's seeing it on the left side, and they're not seeing. The witnesses are not seeing each other. They're at a certain angle. They don't see each other.
Yeah,
that's all. But they see what they need to see. If they need to hear, if that's part of what they're testifying about, they hear what they need to hear. But the question that we're talking about is a different question. That is, let's say there were two different loans, each of $100 between the same people. Let's say I have a friend, he needs money, or he needs tzedakah, or I'm generous, whatever. I gave him $100 in the morning, and I give him another $100 in the afternoon. That's what we're talking about. So one witness sees the morning, and one witness sees the afternoon. The two witnesses are not testifying about the same act.
Right.
But in Dinei Mamonos, that's not what's important, because they are testifying that in the aggregate, that altogether, Reuven lent $100 to Shimon. Each one can say that Reuven lent us $100 to Shimon.
Yeah,
There are
well,
two witnesses that can testify not about the same loan, but that about how much he owes him. Let's change the formulation just a little bit of what they're talking about. If Reuven lent Shimon $100 in the morning, $100 in the afternoon, and each time it was witnessed by one aide, it would not be true to say that you have two aidim, that saw, a single.
but it's even more deficient because if you have to aid them and
Yeah.
they give testimony and that testimony is not exactly the same, the aidus is invalidated. So now
Only
you're
if-
taking,
Only if they're testifying about the same thing in their
well,
discrepancy.
but I'm saying, but here, so I mean, if they
No,
were,
but that's what I'm trying to explain. They're not fooling anybody. They're not saying we both saw the same transaction. There are two witnesses that can testify that Reuven owes Shimon $100. It comes from two different transactions, but he still owes at least $100. If there were two witnesses on each, there would be witnesses that said that he owes $200.
The 200, yeah.
so you have an aid
Because-
echad in each case, and you want to
The way we
combine
say it
the
in the
eid echad.
Halakha, in the Lumdus, we'd say there are two Eidim on the Chiyuv Agavra, even though there are not two Eidim on the Maisa Halva. If you want to know how many witnesses there are on the loan, there's 1 and 1. But if you want to know how many witnesses there are that Reuven owes money to Shimon, there are 2.
I guess
Because in
so.
the bank, he owes
Yeah, yeah.
he actually owes he owes double that amount, but we don't have two witnesses about double. We have two witnesses only on the common denominator, right? So we have two witnesses on the 100. But for Dinei Mamonis, that's good enough. So for the Ran to think that would be good enough in Eidei Kiyum, if it wasn't for the fact that it has a Dinei Nefashos element, shows that he thinks that Eidei Kiyum is like Eidei Birur. But here, ironically, let me look at the Rajba. So the Rajba says, Chidusha Rajba Masachat Gittin, Pei Aleph Omid Beis, on page probably 3. So the Rajba says, Elamas Nisim B'Sharosh Nivala, Rabbi Yochanan Omer Ki Aitanav Anan Kaim Lo Kastam Mishnah. Now says the Rajba, V'Afal Pisha Lo Ra'ua Shanivala. This whole thing is about Yichud. The witnesses didn't actually see that they consummated, this new marriage. Nonetheless, Tricha Mimeni Get Sheni. And then he adds, Afilu Nasam Laksafim.
Well, just to be clear, if they want to stay married, they're okay, right? They don't have to go do a new wedding. You have the two Adam and they're married. It's done. If you have to give a get, that means they're married, right?
Yes, that's Kiddushin. Yeah, or this Kiddushin. But that is the marriage. Yeah, that's one of the.
That's what I'm saying. They don't have to get remarried. The Adam see them, one guy in the morning, one guy in the afternoon. They're married.
No, we say one guy in the morning, one guy in the afternoon doesn't work, but we're trying to explain why it doesn't work. One guy in the morning, one guy in the afternoon doesn't work. Two guys in the morning, two guys
in the afternoon, or the afternoon works. Okay.
So now the Raj was trying to explain this halacha. So he says, that's only if the yichud, right, that took place was in the presence of two witnesses. And the two of them were there together, meaning you can't have one in the morning and one in the afternoon. The aim kan kiddushin.
By the way, then no one is raising the issue.
Just one more line. Kiddushin, ain kiddushin, kiddushin, v'mekadosh beilach and chosheli kiddushin. So just 1 second. So the Rajba is saying, why this doesn't work? Because it's a violation of the requirement of Eidei Kiyum, which is that if you do something in front of anything less than two witnesses, it's 0. So you have 0 in the morning.
That sounds like a definitional approach, like the Roa.
Right. Here is in this some interesting on Pei Aleph on base. The Rajba sounds like the Ra, but the Ran sounds like the Rashba in the other places. The Ran says if it weren't for the fact that there was a nefashos implication or consequence or dimension to Ishus, then we would say it does work, even though it's 1 and 1. How can it be 1 and 1? Each one is 0. The answer is it's not 0. It's only 0. It's only 0 because we don't have evidence that it took place. But between the two events, it's if it wasn't for the fact that it was like it would be like saying, I saw $100 in the morning, and the other guy says I saw $100 in the afternoon. There's one other way to read the Ran. I'm sorry, you were asking a question. I cut you off.
How would they approach this case where a man goes into a room with a woman?
Yeah.
Right, at 10 o'clock. Okay. At 10 o'clock, Ruvain sees it. Ruvain leaves at 10:15. They're still in the room together. Okay.
Right.
And Shimon comes and sees that they're in the room together. Okay. It's the same. So now you have two witnesses at two different times over the, so to speak, the same elongated event. How does that?
That's a great question. That's a great question. That's a great question. I think it would be a very similar argument.
No, because we could say that it is really different because it's one event, one thing. The problem you have is that the two aren't there together. That's a problem. But on the other hand, it's the same event. Two people saw it, and they can both say
same event, but the time there's a.
So we can add another complication to what Andy is saying, that in between those 15 minutes before the second guy came, maybe there was a get, and he gave her a get, and then he's doing another yichud.
it
would be more complicated, but
we have enough problems.
It looks like we're always looking for trouble, but we're really not. Trouble just finds us, but we don't want it for more trouble. Anyways, this is the issue of the Eidos Miuchedes, and it's a very fascinating question. So let me ask a different question. Also something called Eidos Yediyah below Re'iyah. That's another kind of Eidos. What is Yediyah below Re'iyah?
Not really.
Right. I have discussed this when we learned Sanhedrin some years ago, because
Isn't that hearsay?
So you mentioned that we had learned it maybe some years ago, these cases.
I'm saying that what you're saying now is what we call in America hearsay, no?
Yeah. No, not hearsay. No. Hearsay is aid me aid.
But how does he know it if he didn't see it?
No, so it's circumstantial evidence.
Uh-huh.
So this is the famous, it's called Eidos Yediyah below Re'iyah. He knows what happens even though he didn't see it. What's the case? The Gemara says in Sanhedrin and in Shavuos.
He runs after somebody with a hatchet and then he finds a dead body.
Yeah. So that's the case of Shim ben Shetach. Maybe when we discussed that some years ago.
Yeah, we did.
So that's the case. Shim ben Shetach, the guy, this one man is
coming out of the korban. You saw the guy coming out of the
another man, an out, he's drawn his sword, the blade is very sharp, and he chases him into, a cave, with no exit, and the person is following him. Let's say Shim ben Shetach is following him, he falls a little behind. So he doesn't actually see, Ruvain kill Shimon. By the time he gets onto the scene, the sword, is inside the victim, and the blood is dripping everywhere. And I say there's no other explanation. So that's what Shim ben Shetach said. Ereb in Nechama, he said, either I killed him or you killed him, and I know I didn't kill him. And you were running after him, screaming about, the Hatfields and the McCoys or whatever it was. And, so he says, I know you killed him, but what can I do? That's what the Gemara says. Ma'aseh, it says, Al Pishnai, you need two actual witnesses, to convict somebody of a capital crime. And
doesn't have one.
What? You don't even have one?
Have one witness.
However, in Dine Mominus, once again, let's say, for capital crime, this doesn't work. But for a monetary obligation, usually we say Eidos Yediyah below Re'iyah, that's a machlokas. The Rambam paskins in Parak Chaf of Hilchos Eidos and the Sefer Mitzvos that, Eidos Yediyah below Re'iyah, meaning circumstantial evidence or very strong umdana, what we sometimes call it, works in Dine Mominus, just not in Dine Nefashos. He actually compares it to Eidos Umdana. To Eidos Miuchedes, sorry, what we were discussing a few minutes ago.
What would be an Eidos Mominus example of this thing?
So Rav Soloveitchik used to say the following. He said, like, how come the Rambam compares it to Eidos Miuchedes? They're two different cases. Here's a case of circumstantial evidence. There's a case of combining two individuals. So he explained very, very cleverly that on another level, it's the same thing. Because why in Dinei Mamres does the Eidos Miuchedes combine? Because what I said before, on the Maisa Halva, there's only one witness each time. But on the Chiyuv Hagavra, on the personal obligation, right, there are two witnesses. So what he wanted to say was, when you have Eidos Yediyah below Re'iyah, if you know something happened, even though you didn't see it, so you don't have witnesses on the event, but you have witnesses on the Chiyuv, because you know it happened. There's no other explanation. What is it, Sherlock used to say, as I always like to quote, you eliminate the impossible. All that remains, no matter how improbable, is the truth. So in this case, it isn't even improbable. So
in a way, the Shem Meshetach event, the person is sort of not the Gavra anymore, the victim. He's sort of like the. No,
the point is, you know the effect, the result.
Gavra is the murderer. There you don't have no proof. The proof you have is on the chayfetz, almost like on the victim.
Well, you have the idea, but you don't have the ria. But the point is, in Dinei Mamres, what do you care? You still have witnesses that can tell you that he's chayiv. They can't tell you about the halva, but they can tell you that he owes the $100 if that were the equivalent, case. So, what about ishus? Right?
Dinei nefashos.
No. What about edei kiyum? So there are all sorts of interesting cases. So the Rajba has this famous tshuva, and the Maram Rutenberg has a tshuva. A man is, he tells everybody that he's going to get married, to this war. He's going to pop the question to this fiancée, right? And then you see him, the case of the Rajba, the famous case. He walks, he has a very nice esrog, it's Sukkot time probably. He walks in, with the esrog, and then you hear him even, proposing. Or you see, or if let's say you didn't hear it, doesn't make a difference. You didn't see it though. You're not in the room. But then she comes out, smiling, holding the esrog.
He was Mekadosh with the esrog.
He's Mekadosh with the esrog. That's a case of Tshuvas Rajba. So the Rajba says it doesn't work. It's no good. Because you need, edei kiyum, and there are no edei kiyum.
According to the Ra'ad, surely wouldn't work.
Right. Even the Rajba thinks it doesn't work. So this is the question they all ask. How come, but how do you have Edim for Kiddushay Biyah? Obviously, it would be unseemly. It would be the antithesis of Tznius, to actually have Edim for
there it's different because the Yichud itself serves as the act, so to speak.
So but is that true? And we're not talking about chuppah now. We're not talking about Nisuin. We're talking about Kiddushay Biyah. So the Yichud isn't enough.
Just like we accuse a married woman, if she's with a person in Yichud, we assume that something happened. So we do use that same...
right, but isn't that based on Umdana? Isn't that based on Yediyah below Re'iyah? I mean, you're right.
Well, we use it all the time.
Right, but 1 second. So the expression, by the way, is that we use for Kiddushay Biyah, for the Edim, is Hein Edei Yichud, Hein Edei Biyah. I mean, you're right. But the question that the Rishonim asked this question, Ram Rutenberg, the Rajba, it's quoted in the Tshuvas Maimunios, which is a vehicle for Ram Rutenberg Tshuvas, and so
we have some kind of a chazaka here also, so to speak, or
chazaka,
a man and a woman in certain conditions that allow certain things to happen will happen.
So that's kind of what the Rishonim answer. But what do they mean by that? A stronger umdana? Stronger? Is anything stronger than Shimon ben Shetach? So what the answer may very well be is, like, as you said, there might be a difference between like a predictive umdana or circumstantial evidence. Like, it's not just that sometimes you have circumstantial evidence where you reconstruct it, in light of, you go backwards, like a forensic analysis. So this is obviously what happened, reconstructing. But sometimes, and even if it's clear, it's obvious, and then you could say, oh, now I understand that when he was screaming at him and he was running after him, like when the Shimon Shefach case, he's running after him and he has the knife out and so on. Until he kills him, you think he's going to come to his senses, or maybe the other guy will fight back, or he'll, or he'll
run away, get away, escape.
Whatever. Once you see him he's he's in the cave and there's no way out, and the fellow is dying, and the blood is dripping off of the sword. I don't mean to be so graphic, but this is the Gemara's case. What can I tell you? So then you know what happened, but you know what happened in retrospect, reconstructively. But when it comes to yichud haroy lebiak and certain pattern, hein yichud, hein it's exactly what you were saying before. But I'm trying to give some objective.
It's actually a stronger point, because since there is for him to be with the woman, unless, in other words, since there's also a negative that says you shouldn't be with this woman in this condition to begin with. So if he is in that condition, then we have to assume that, so it's added to the positive chazaka is the fact that he crossed a line which he couldn't cross unless that was intention.
So number one, there's that, and number two is some of the Rishonim use the expression. It's like when it's like there's a fire and it's going to burn things down, meaning the passions that have been inflamed, are predictive. There's a predictive element, to it. The point is that this isn't. It's both a stronger umdana, a predictive umdana. As you say, there's an Easter element in it. So, for that reason, it's not your typical even yediyah below re'iyah. It's more like what you saw is the beginning of the action. So this is a big debate in Eidei Kiyum in this case. So the Ksos HaChoshen, if you look at it just for a minute here, it's like in the very end of the Marmakomos, the very important Ksos HaChoshen, where he discusses this problem. What about Eidei Kiyum on Eidos Umdana? It's like the last two pages. One second. Let's see if I can find it. One second. Yeah. It's, you see the paragraph Lachein Nira Lanias Daiti? I don't know if people have the Marmakomos. For me, it's on page 11. Lachein Nira Lanias Daiti. Hold on one second. I just have to hold on one second because I'm on my phone. I have to plug it in. Just one second. Okay, everybody still with me here? Yeah. Okay. Beginning of Lachein Nira Lanias Daiti. Do we have that? Everybody have that? Okay, I'm getting a nod. Okay. So if you go to the middle of that paragraph, you'll see one second. The imkain kol shebiyadua, any situation in which there is yediyah, means certainty, but we know what happened even if we haven't seen it. Havalek edemamish. So then he goes on and says, "Va'ayin b'simin tzadi, b'sham sif katan zayin, kasavne mized, d'sfir le'laran, d'mahani b'kiddushin v'gitin." Everybody have that? When it comes to gitin and kiddushin, mahani edus b'yediyah, shelo al pi re'iyah. That when you have very strong, predictive even, maybe, but in the certain conditions, you don't actually have witnesses who see, but you have witnesses who know that
Is
that
that
might
not?
be enough.
Yeah. Sorry.
You have-
Sorry. No,
You have
no.
it there? Are you able to find it?
No, I don't have the.
I'm in the middle of the paragraph. Ba'ayin b'simin tzadi sif cotton zayin kasavnu mizeh. The spiritual leran the mahani b'kiddushin v'gitzin edus b'yediyah shalo al pi re'iyah. Umishum hachi b'mamon the baldavar kamea edim dami lo ibri sahadi al shakri. The baldavar who aid v'neman kamea edim etzleinu. Ubiadua stagi hein be'edim mamish obidia b'li re'iyah. Aber begitten b'kiddushin the lo mahani odas baldin the lahem ne kamea edim mishum dechayv lachrini b'kiddushin the asar krovosaha and so on. Tzarich edim leguf ha'maisa b'chtei sheyodei ali alma mishum harchi tzarich shnei edim sheirin. So what I'm trying to show is,
That's the Rashba's Shita.
yes, so this whole Ksosachoshen is really based on the Rajba in Kiddushin. And if you look earlier, I'm just going to start, from back from the beginning, you'll see just in the beginning of the piece, Siman Reish Mem Aleph, Sivkat Aleph, he starts off by saying, Be'ika l'meidek ma'ishna begitin v'kiddushin, the be'inan shnei edem al guf ha'maisa, u'beino leveino lav klumhu, v'afilu shnei modim. Why is there such a phenomenon as edikiyum, which determines that you always need two witnesses on the actual event, right? And that if you don't have them, even if everybody agrees what happened, it's not good enough. The Ofina lo beperka omer davar davar mimamon. After all, doesn't Edus and Kiddushin also come from davar davar mimamon, which is from the world of Choshen Mishpat, where if everybody agrees, we don't need witnesses.
Everybody agrees it's stronger than circumstantial evidence.
Yeah. Even the gabi mamon miskayim amaisa b'liyedim kolsha inyan emes, and if in dini mamonis, as long as it's true, you don't need witnesses. The kiddushin that gets into mamon yalev lo niskayim amaisa b'liyedim, and yet when it comes to kiddushin, which is derived from it, even if we believe
is
it
more
to be
than
true,
mamon. Kiddushin is
how can
also
we-
Isurin.
yes, but what he's asking is, how can you learn it from mamon if it's more than mamon? The laws of
We have a rule that you can't do that.
the
You
laws
can't
of
learn something
derivation
from
are
something that's
such,
less severe. You can't learn something more severe and something that's less severe. That's a clown.
right? That's what he's asking. That's exactly what he's asking. So he says, you know what? This is a really good question. But I'm not the first person to ask this question. Who asked it before me? The Rajba. V'nitkasheshi b'zeh ad shemasasi kushazu b'chidushei Rajba perka omer ayin sham shekasav v'yolav davar mimamon b'makom akchasha netzarich shnei edim hakanami b'inan b'kiddushin v'gitin shnei edim al guf ha'maisa afilu shnei modim. So this is the the Ksos is saying, I had this problem, it always bothered me. It's to the Rajba, beat me
it's not
to
such
it.
a big problem because the act of Kiddushin is a monetary act. The consequences are Isurin, but the act itself, so to speak, is a kinyan. So
No, for sure, that is true. But
so
in the
therefore
end of it,
they are in an equal status in that
they're
respect.
not. But the point is that the derivation that you require Adam comes from Mammon. So you're still overreaching, or seemingly overreaching, when you're saying that you need, the presence of witnesses, and the proof is from needing the evidence of witnesses.
No, but in other words, we were concerned that the Kiddushin is more severe because of the Isser and the Foshets and whatever.
Right, so maybe that might be the answer, but it's
I'm
still...
saying the act of Kiddushin is the act of a kinyan and mominus. The consequence is another story, but the act itself could be compared to Dine mominus because the act of Kiddushin, and you're trying to validate that act at this point. So if you want to validate that act, forget about the consequences for a moment.
Right, but in a way, what you're saying, it goes the opposite of what we need. That's what we're trying to explain is, why do you need presence and validation in Ishus when you don't need it in Mammon, right? Even though the source of needing it at all
I'm going the other
comes,
direction. Okay.
right. So that's the problem. But in the end of the day, so things like Edus Muchedes, Edus Umdana, Psula Edus Dirabanan, Ede Chasima, which we began with, Yichud Ha'edim, Edim Machore Hageder, Edim that are hiding, all these end up being, and there are more, like big issues that distinguish Ede Kiyum and Ede Birur. Meaning there is I wouldn't say 50%, I'm not sure if it's 50%, but it's, the greats of medieval halacha, and by extension then the poskim, and the generations after them, have this enormous conflict and debate about how different Ede Kiyum and Kiddushin is from its mother source, Ede Birur in Mamonis. And I've just listed off some of the things that we've discussed in the last 2 weeks, about 7 or 8 different real consequences in terms of the difference between these two adios. Whereas the Rajba, usually the Ksos, the Or Sameach, most of them are saying the differences aren't so great. Mostly the rules are the same, and you have to tweak them a little bit. And the Ra'ah, Reb Chaim, Rabbeinu Tam, the Ritva, they're all saying no. Even though there's an overlap between these two concepts, they're very, very different. One is about evidence and lying and proving, and the other is about formally recognizing, validating, giving stature to, defining, and these are very different ideas. So what I want to pick up with next week when we finish all this is I want to discuss the relationship between Ede Kiyum in Gittin and Kiddushin, because the only source for Ede Kiyum that we've been discussing is the Gemara in Kiddushin Samach Hamid Beis. It's only explicit in the entire Talmud with respect to Kiddushin. The Rambam and Rabbeinu Tam both assume that it applies to Gerushin as well, which is a good assumption because it's the parallel to Kiddushin. It's also Ishas. But what I'm going to try to show is next week is that the Rajba disagrees. He thinks that it doesn't apply to Gerushin. That's point number 1. And then what I really want to show is that the Rambam treats Ede Kiyum, which he thinks applies to Kiddushin and Gerushin, but he treats them differently. He treats them as if they are 2 different things. Just 1 second, I'm going to conk out. Not only am I having internet problems, but I'm having charging problems. When the technology breaks down, it breaks down. 1 second. Oh, okay. So, right. So what I want to discuss next week, this all comes to a head in discussions of Ksav Yad. Meaning, so let me just introduce the idea. The Mishnah on Pevav and Gittin, which we saw, and the Gemara in Gimel and Beis says that Minat Torah, a get could also be written b'ksav yad, without Eidim. It could be written by the hand writing.
Well, but that is Edus, basically.
Yeah. So does that work in a Shtar Kiddushin?
I think it does.
So that's the debate between.
I think we learned this one. I think if it's in his own hand, it serves as proof because that's his.
No, we discussed whether
that's his MO.
Works in Dini Mamonis. In Dini Mamonis, it's a question, and it's also but in Kiddushin, it's actually a debate. The Rajba in Yevamos and in Kiddushin says that Ksav Yad, meaning an autograph, works in Gittin but not in Kiddushin. Not in Kiddushin. And the Ritva says if it works in Gerushin, it works in Kiddushin. Kol Shekain, it certainly works in Kiddushin. So I want to discuss that argument, and I want to try to analyze the Rambam's position.
Okay, looking forward. Next week, right?
All right, good night.
Yeah.
All right, next week. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Have a good
Good night. Good night.
Hopefully the internet will be back.
Mirza Hashem. Thank you.
Have a